Welcome to the Cove Podcast, your stop for PME on the go.
Good afternoon or good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the Cove Podcast. I'm Captain Todd Lemper, and in today's episode, we're going to talk about Army aviation. Specifically, we're going to talk about lift aircraft. We'll bleed a little bit into the attack stuff as well, I imagine. But we've got a current serving CH-47 pilot from the 5th Aviation Regiment, Captain Mac Purbrick. How you going, Mac?
G'day guys, thanks Todd for having me on.
No worries. So I suppose what we want to do in this episode is flesh out, it's not recruiting for pilots, despite the fact that you'll definitely try and do that, I think, Mac. It's also not about the CH-47 specifically. It's just a platform we're going to use because you do fly it. But more broadly, what we're going to talk about is the state of play in Army aviation, I suppose. Before we do that, though, I think that's a huge question to ask you straight off the bat. So rather than doing that, I think what the listeners want to know is, like, obviously you're doing a lot of flying at the 5th Aviation Regiment. We'll talk about that. But, Mac, what was your last flight that you did?
My last flight was 2 days ago. We are down here in Point Cook. We're supporting Avalon International Air Show. And as a part of that, we were able to take up 2 aircraft in a formation flight through the Port Phillip Bay, Mornington Peninsula, and down to the 12 Apostles. So pretty memorable flight. It actually turned out to be a very challenging flight in terms of captaincy, with multiple minor aircraft non-serviceabilities and quite a few captaincy challenges. So if anyone ever says that a scenic WAS is not a good challenge flight, I would beg to differ.
Yeah.
But we can talk about that later.
If, because I'm not going to make this claim, but some people have argued that the Army sucks the fun out of everything. Like, is that the case with some of the flying you do? Like the mission planning and stuff, there's a huge sort of, I'll use the word burden, it probably isn't that way, but like there's a lot of work that goes into each flight, even if you just want to go for a scenic flight over the 12 Apostles on the Great Ocean Road.
I think there's some fun to be had. We can definitely squeeze the fun back in. Yeah.
That's good. So when you flew down, so I think a lot of people, so we're at the Avalon Air Show now, which will date the episode, but in recording from the officers' mess at Point Cook. But I think a lot of people think that you just fly from Townsville, which is where the 5th Aviation Regiment is, and that you just can fly all the way down to sort of Victoria or, what was the flight like coming down this far?
Yeah, so it actually is multiple flights, and it's a huge logistical burden and challenge to actually get an aviation trip like this off and organise it and then actually execute it. And there's always going to be massive change along the way. I think that's a massive lesson to note for everyone dealing with aviation is we don't make changes because we like screwing you around. We make changes because there's a lot of external elements and our serviceabilities, weather considerations. That does have quite a significant effect on our flying operations. And sometimes the plan will change. But for us, the plan, we departed Townsville, had some pretty challenging weather and had to track coastal down to Amberley, refueled at Amberley, had an overnight stop there, then went from Amberley down to Richmond and was able to link in with some US Apache soldiers there and pilots. From there, we were planning on having a day of workup training, formation briefings, and really just integrating because we're not familiar with operating with Apaches. But like everything in our role, that changed. We had weather coming in and we had to depart the next morning. So a whole day's worth of planning, briefing and executing was shortened down to a 1 hour planning serial, and we left first thing the next morning. And that's very representative of how it goes in our business.
So a lot of planning goes into each mission, and I suppose every time you fly. We'll talk about that later on when I talk about operational flying and some constraints of the aircraft, but also opportunities. But before we do that, I suppose many people in Army, and it's not technically supposed to be like topical stuff, but there has been a lot of conjecture about Army aviation over the last couple of years and the changes and stuff. So you probably can't talk to the brigade headquarters more broadly, and obviously this is about your own experience, but I think if you could set the situation and a rough ground brief for Army aviation, specifically to the 5th Aviation Regiment, what does it look like? We used to have 2 MRH squadrons and a Chinook squadron. I imagine it's not that case anymore, and we've been battling with different aircraft and then flying some civilian stuff and contracted air and that. What does 5th Aviation Regiment look like right now?
Yeah, let's talk through a state of play of, the union of how it is looking on the ground at 5th Aviation Regiment. So C squadrons remain largely unchanged throughout a lot of the flux we've seen the last 5 at least years. C Squadron is a Chinook squadron. We operate at the moment 14 aircraft, of which we're always rotating through aircraft through a deep maintenance and servicing, just like you would have your car service. And we can talk about some of the maintenance requirements of operating aircraft later in the episode. Additional to that is our 139 Squadron, which is B Squadron. They're not co-located in Townsville anymore. They're now operated out of Oakey, and their contract with Toll is, I believe, to be ending this year. So they're going to transition to, or Army Aviation is going to transition from 139 as a capability building interim solution to a 135 or an EC135, H135, whatever you want to call it, which is going to provide ability for pilot trainees and experienced pilots to get on the tools before or during capability changes in around all of this change we've had with MRH departing the organisation, Tiger moving out, Apache coming in, Black Hawk coming in as well.
You say 139, 135. So the EC135 flown in Albatross as well as the training aircraft for the helicopter school there. Obviously, what is a 139 though that B Squadron fly?
The 139, apologies, a lot of jargon, is a Augusta Westland 139. It's it's a civvy chopper that is flown throughout Australia as primarily a HEMS aircraft, so helicopter EMS or patient recovery and retrieval aircraft primarily. Also found commonly in a lot of the police agencies as well. And we had Toll come in essentially to provide pilots who are transitioning mostly off MRH in that capability gap period, provide them an aircraft to fly before moving on to another operational type, because that's where we need our pilots on operational types. So it's a capability shortfall.
I know that Navy is struggling to get people converted to, or pilots converted from the 135 into the conversion aircraft, being Romeos, or is that Romeos is what they fly?
Yeah, they do, yeah.
Does Army Aviation still have the same issue where we've got a big backlog of pilots that are qualified on a helicopter, for instance, but they haven't been through operational conversion?
Yeah, we do. There's a lot of interim LTs sitting around at Oakey, and that's why 135, the EC135, which is flown down at Nowra and now is going to be flown up at Oakey, is an aircraft there to allow those guys to really refine their skills and their captaincy before moving on to the next aircraft type.
So obviously 2 operational squadrons at the 5th Aviation Regiment, B Squadron flying 139s, those helicopters you're talking about before, but at Oakey, and then C Squadron still flying CH-47 or Chinooks in Townsville there. How long has C Squadron been flying Chinook aircraft?
We are about to celebrate our 30th birthday as a squadron, as a capability. And that community actually outlasts C Squadron, the Army component, back to the 12 Squadron days, because we had Charlie model and then transitioned to Delta model Chinooks before the Foxtrots. So that Chinook history extends way back into the RAF days of 12 Squadron. And actually recently we just had it ticked up to fly under the call sign Buffalo, which is a homage to the 12 Squadron guys.
And you talked about variations there, a step through. I don't want to go through them all because Chinooks is quite an old aircraft. I think some people might think that it's quite new or it's super old, isn't it? How old is the aircraft itself? I
think the first flights of the Chinook were about 1961. And you can sit in the back of a Chinook, of an early Chinook, a Vietnam era Chinook, with no stabilisation systems, none of the fancy longitudinal cyclic trims and really advanced AFCS we have now, and you can still trace the hydraulic lines and the fuel lines that are exactly the same on an aircraft 60 years down the future.
Yeah, that is insane. So what does the newest variant bring, the Foxtrot variant?
Yeah, so we've had the Foxtrot for good on 8 years or so in the Army here. The US have been operating it much longer in the US Army. But it provides a full glass cockpit, a very complicated is the wrong word, but a very complex and advanced AFCS system, so flight stabilization system, and a very, very good and developed mission planning system, and the ability to rapidly reorientate, acknowledge threats in the battle space, plot threats, communicate threats to other aircraft, and really just get our external loads and soldiers and whoever we're supporting into the areas they need to be in a very rapid way.
I think you talked about 30 years of flying Chinook at Sea Squadron, celebrating that anniversary. I suppose we've seen, or from the outside looking in at the squadron, we've seen, Chinook deliver M777s or field artillery into the field. They conduct AMO for insertion for troops. How many troops can you fit in the back, sorry? Depend on configuration. You're about to tell me. Yeah,
it's about 19 people. If we go on 19 people, it works with the most limiting requirement.
It's like the infantry saying it's terrain dependent. Yeah.
Log just happens.
Yeah, that's good. I'm glad. You carry generators into flood zones, talking about log, and then delivering bulk fuel. I suppose for those not familiar with that aircraft type, and we're going to specifically talk about Chinooks only because you are a Chinook pilot, and it's probably the most, I'm going to throw it out there, you don't have to, but the most reliable rotary wing aircraft we have to fly today. What can it do, the platform itself, but also what can the crews do that are inside it?
Yeah, so essentially we exist as a cargo helicopter. That's why it's called the CH-47, CH cargo. That's why we're there, to move cargo, be it in a CSS or a combat service support or combat support capability, moving ammo, underslung, moving M777s, moving generators we just talked about before, and Ingham floods just recently. And then also in a more direct air mobile sense, we could be moving infantry troops in the back, other enabling call signs. But really what we're there to do is just move things around. It's as simple as that. And the level at which we tie into your planning and in when we're supporting depends on what role we're doing. If we're doing a DAC task, it may be as simple as, you're picking something up here and dropping it off here. And it's up to the pilots and the crews to determine how they get there, what are the requirements, how many taps we can do, what is our fuel burn, where are we going to refuel. Or it could be as detailed as a 3-day mission planning serial where you're sitting in a windowless room while we conduct a lot of mission planning and then flying that with a very, very detailed mission planning products, overlays, enemy analysis, the full Army officer suite, I guess, in planning in that regard.
I think that's an interesting point. I'm going to talk about what you've done in the last couple of years at 5AB and the regiment more broadly, but it's an interesting point to zoom in on is the fact that I think, and it's why I've thrown it out to the Air Warfare Evaluation section to get them on for an episode to talk about the future of Army aviation, rotary wing specifically lift in contested environments and with a commensurate air defence threat. And hopefully we get them on. They've said no up until this point, but I'll try and get them on. But to talk about the future of aviation in a high threat environment, I sort of want to come back as like you constantly, I suppose the preference is to go to safety, right? And civilian regulations, you have to sort of always weigh up sort of civilian regulations, but also tactically flying, right? No one else really, transport has to do that with road transport, but it is significantly easier. But like you're constantly toing and froing between huge safety regulations, but also everyone expects you to be tactically sound and flying, tactically. For those in infantry and armoured that can just concentrate on their core role, how difficult is that jumping between DAC and then to tactical flying and then all that sort of stuff?
Yeah, I guess employing our aircraft and our community, our whole capability is like employing a pocket knife. We can do many, many jobs. We may not be able to do it perfectly. We may not be able to do it better than anything else, but we're there for a whole suite of contingencies and roles. And that is a massive juxtaposition I find in our role at the moment. But all we can do is practice to be the best we can at the things we can do at this point in time. And then when those rules change, we can continue to be the best we can in those new environments when those restrictions change. So a common example is height, which it refers to helicopter insertion and extraction techniques. At this point in time, the Chinook is not authorised for height, and that was a restriction placed upon the capability after the Bushman 83 crash. And as a result, we can't do military freefall and also hover serials where we drop out our infantry, Zodiacs and personnel. We can still train for those serials. We can still train in the sim. We can't do it in person. So we still train in those serials without dropping people out. And those training sequences will continue regardless of the rule set not being able to do it live. So we just try and be the best we can at the moment with the rules and restrictions we can. And that's as simple as.
So to go back, I think it's a link to the close air support episode when we had the backseater of the Super Hornet on Pete. He's talking about, the Super Hornet can do so many different things, and CAS is one of the things they don't often do, close air support. So if you haven't listened to the episode, go back and have a listen. But I think your Swiss Army knife or your Army knife sort of analogy rings true. What sort of, so you just talked about two things that you can't do, or one thing that you can't do, but subsequently, what are the things that you do really well and are well drilled at? Like, what are your bread and butter? Do you know what I mean? The things that the aircraft and the crew inside it can do incredibly well.
I think our baseline is being able to operate off a ship at night, 50 foot as a sort of clearance off the ground, any trees, environment, whatever. 50 foot at night off a ship into a pad we haven't seen before. That's the sort of baseline we operate to. Whether that's moving soldiers, an N777, it doesn't matter. But that's what we train to. And I think we're really, I'm not going to say we're really good at it.
But you get the most hours doing that, right? So that's like, out of everyone we've got, you fly, I presume you fly the most amount of hours and you get the most amount of tasks.
Well, let's just talk about what we're going to do this year.
Yeah.
We started this year with Townsville and Ingham floods, where we spent 2 weeks straight moving generators, fuel cells, and constant warehouse pallets. We had 40 Mark trucks rolling up to our hangars. Didn't even know where they're coming from. Just a constant feed of pallets, unloaded, loaded in the back of our choppers on forklifts, because we've got a cargo loading system. We can just roll it straight in. Those aircraft were just moving to and from Ingham, resupplying a whole town. I think it's a town of 6,000 people. No one fact-checked me on that. And that town was going to go out of power for once, out of water, if we hadn't moved those generators in on the first night. And then from then on, we provided all of the food going to Ingham. No one fact-checked me on that either. After that, we had 2 weeks, essentially just resetting normal ops. And as we were stepping into some further training for our currencies, gunnery and that sort of thing, we had to step off for Tropical Cyclone Alfred relief, move down the coast for that, and had to return due to that cyclone moving through. One weekend back in Townsville, and we're down for Avalon Air Show. Awesome trip. We'll return back to Townsville after that. We have a month of RTP, and then we're on to the boat for C Series. Following C Series, operating embarked off one of the LHDs for about a month. We'll have a bit of time off again, and then just step out for the Vigilant Scimitar and Talisman Sabre series of exercises, and then hopefully move to Papua New Guinea at the end of the year. So that's sort of representative of all the tasks we usually complete in a year, and I guess the variety of jobs we do.
I suppose that's an interesting point, because sandwiched in there is more training, right? So you, if I've got it right, you went over to the US to do a maintenance test pilot course on the CH-47. Question is, why did you have to go to the US to do that, not here? And subsequently, I suppose, what is that course that was weaved into all of the things that you did last year and the year before? Like, how does that, what does that change your job?
In my appreciation of the situation, we go to the US because of economies of scale. We have a very small Chinook footprint, 14 aircraft. It's a drop in the ocean. They had 40 aircraft, 40 Chinooks on one base, on one airfield, one base in the States. Their course allows us to leverage their incredible experience in operating that airframe. And I went over there for 3 months to learn the in-depth requirements of maintenance flying. And you may ask, what is maintenance flying and why do we do it? Essentially, it's pretty simple. If you had a car that has a check engine light, you take it in the mechanic fixes the car, the mechanic takes the car for a lap around the block. Our tradies can't fly the aircraft. They can't take it for a lap around the block. We're doing that for them. So there's a bit of a trust and relationship there where I understand the work they're doing and we work together to determine what checks are required to check this aircraft off as serviceable. And then from there, it can be returned to the fleet.
And all that training's done in the US. So your maintainer's going over with you to do that course in the US, or is that with US sort of techos?
That was with US techos, yeah.
Yeah. And then you come back. I suppose when they go through, you just talked about the maintenance life cycle for Chinook is currently like, you know, you've always got someone in deep maintenance, I presume, and then subsequently always getting repaired, right? So the tradesmen do the actual work and they get their hands dirty and stuff, and then they do the mechanical work on the aircraft, and then they hand it back to you with a list of, you talked about you both come up with that list to test the capability aircraft post that maintenance. I suppose how does that present when they give that list to you, and what do you do? Because I imagine that's like maybe not every flight is high risk, but some would be high risk, right? We've just replaced something that is pivotal to the aircraft. I suppose, what's it like taking off, like knowing full well that it's like chances are it's going to be absolutely okay. But we talk about that risk, like the likelihood versus consequence. What's it like flying an aircraft that is just you're the first one flying it after deep maintenance, for example?
I think it's a trust-based relationship, and we are really lucky to have an incredible maintenance crew here. And as with all high-performance teams, it relies upon everyone being on the same level and the same understanding, and everyone understands their role and how it connects together. So the maintenance managers will work with them as a maintenance test pilot and determine what's been changed or what's been fixed, what's been really played with, and then what are the consequences of that being done. So will this impact on this flight regime, this flight regime, this flight regime? And then we'll just do a graduated approach through the checklist to check the flight out, check the aircraft out, firstly on the ground, then in the hover, and then in flight, where the severity consequence starts to increase. But I've never felt at any point after any maintenance has occurred that I was concerned about the aircraft serviceability or concerned about my own danger being the pilot or the crew involved in checking that aircraft, because we have such a good relationship with our maintainers. And if there was a problem, we just wouldn't fly it. It wouldn't get to that point.
Yeah, so the check's already done. Yeah. Do you have contingency in the aircraft to be able to fly? So I suppose the most risky aircraft, again, from an arbitrary looking in, is like a single engine, right? Because you have no fat in the, no contingency. Chinook has some contingency in being twin engine. Is there always sort of something that you can go to? I suppose what's the biggest fault you've had in the aircraft, and how would you go about fixing that sort of stuff?
Yeah, of course. So being a multi-engine aircraft, we have contingency to return to single-engine flying operations. Of course, there's some flight regimes where you just may not have single-engine performance, and you'll plan and brief to fly around that. But like any chopper, the Chinook can auto-rotate, and that's our kind of last resort.
What do you mean by auto-rotate, sorry?
That is where you're trading the auto-rotational airflow through the rotors as you descend down on the air. That will spin the rotor system, and that will provide lift back through using the pitch of those blades to provide, a reduced rate of descent.
Yeah, to slow yourself down from hitting the ground.
Yeah, which you'll trade that potential energy in the rotor system, in the flare, to reduce your rate of descent further and then settle on the ground.
With no engines?
Yep. Has
that happened to you before, if you had to auto-rotate to get to the ground?
We practice auto-rotating, not in the Chinook as such, just due to the complexity of the aircraft, but particularly in the EC-135, it was a very common sequence to practice. But no, it hasn't happened to me in person.
Thank God. So I suppose that's the aircraft and like balancing the safety of the aircraft versus the tactical flying. If we just switch tack straight to tactical flying. So one of the jobs I talked about that CH-47 as a Swiss Army knife being able to do is AMO for or air mobile operations for infantry, inserting into the field or where make up a destination, right? So you work alongside that sort of platoon commander or combat team commander, for instance, to develop a plan that has your component as a phase, which is the AMO. When you lift the aircraft up, it's absolutely awesome. You pick them up off the parade ground at 4 reg, for example, or 1 RR, and then they jump in the back, so 2 sections in the back, for example, and then you start flying in. What sort of things can change that route that you take, or what sort of things can change as you're in the air, approaching that LZ to insert the combat team or platoon size element into a training area or in real life into sort of the battle space?
I think the first major consideration, which commonly rears its head, is weather. We are operating in this very, very narrow band of space between the terrain and the cloud base. And in, a contemporary environment where there is a significant air defence threat, we are increasingly sandwiched closer and closer down towards that terrain. And that's where we talk about that not below 50 feet common training authorisation in the training area. It's a very small wedge when you have a cloud base coming down of where we can fly. So we have to divert and move around, which can be significant track miles. So think about the whole Townsville special to get in to where you want us to get in. And that may be moving to another landing zone we know, shutting down there, or just sitting on the APU, sitting there in a hold in a safe area. For the weather to clear, it could mean flying racetracks somewhere else. Or it could just mean a big diversion around what you thought was going to be the flight route. We'll plan for a flight route and an alternate flight route based on our appreciation of the weather, but so much changes. And the other thing as well is if you went towards a more near peer or a complicated fight, there's going to be some sort of controlling agency integrating all of these air assets, UAS, fixed wing, rotary wing. There'll be ROSs popping up for artillery, HIMARS, you name it. It's all going to be happening. And we all have to work together to move through this very narrow sandwich of airspace. So there could be a ROS that pops up on our restricted operating zone that pops up on our route. We're going to move around it. That could add time. We may be able to pick that time up. But things change. That's what I'm trying to get at. And that's where we have that relationship and conversation about alternate landing zones and holding areas. You may be sitting on the back. Hopefully we can get you on comms as the manoeuvre commander. But understand that we have your intent and that's what we're trying to achieve. And sometimes that means that we may drop your soldiers 5 Ks from the X when we've told you we're going to be right there in the thick of it, and we may not be able to give you an explanation for it.
And I think that that's an important part of like leaning into the planning prior, because I think the assumption, you talked about a cargo helicopter before, picking people up, dropping them off, it's nowhere near that simple, right? There are so many things that change and variables that change and constraints that are applied to you as you get sandwiched between the cloud cover and between the ground, and you're trying to fly tactically to avoid man pads, for example, or a commensurate air defence threat. And then I suppose that's, so route aside, if the manoeuvre commander is incredibly flexible with the route and there are no issues whatsoever, and they've got a bit of fat in the time, as you come into a landing zone, I suppose, what can make that landing zone untenable and subsequently mean that you have to sort of shift to an alternate landing zone on the fly or hopefully something that you've continued to plan for and you can land at a different LZ?
Yeah, and we talk about this cherry ice criteria, which is a conversation between the manoeuvre commander and ourselves as to what we're going to accept in stepping into a landing zone. Cherry being it's too hot, we're going to get out of there, sit at a holding area, and hope that there's another asset there that can treat that risk.
When you say too hot, treat that risk, so you're coming in and there are rockets, so people are firing at you, right? Or you are alerted to a threat on the ground and stuff that makes that landing zone untenable. And then you say treating a threat, you mean that you use another sort of, not battlefield operating system because they don't exist anymore, but another asset to, so for example, call artillery or HIMARS onto that landing zone to clear it.
Yeah, or it could just be you have a recon section sitting there. They provided an assessment of the enemy situation on the ground there, and they provide the cherry and ice criteria, or they confirm the cherry and ice criteria which we've provided them. And that's where we would seek other assets to treat those risks if it was in and above the cherry criteria that we've set. So, for example, a platoon of soldiers of infantry moving into an urban operations facility, for example, they may be concerned with no more than a section size element, HMG, this, that and the other. For us, if that section size element is situated on the far side, unable to direct fires onto our landing zone, that's mitigated. But if we have known man pads in the area providing significant risk onto ourselves and our aircraft, then that's something we may seek to be treated prior. The same goes for technicals, HMG, those assets that will actually stop us from getting in and provide a great risk to our airframe, because we have miniguns on the side in a Chinook, but they're a self-defense asset. We're not there to be, we're not a gunship.
Yeah.
There was Chinook gunships in Vietnam, but we are not those assets, and we're not going to provide that offensive capability. We're there to defend ourselves, to get our people in or our loads in. That's how it works.
And just a sidebar though, and this might test your tab data, but like the minigun on the side of the aircraft, how long can it fire for? You're talking about self-defense, but also what rate of fire can it get off?
Yep, there'll be a plane spotter out there questioning me on this tab data, but it's about 3,000 rounds a minute, and we carry about 4,000 rounds. So, and that's each side. So essentially, the guys are firing in bursts, but you can put a significant rate of fire down to allow us to extricate ourselves from a situation in that requirement. And we will set fire to everything around us.
Yeah.
9-bit trace.
Yeah. And I suppose that's you coming to the land self-defense, LZ, you're sighting at different LZ, and that makes the manoeuvre commander or any commander in the back, so they have to do a planning cycle on the back of the aircraft to reassess like whether their mission is viable, but also how to meet the commander's intent, I suppose, because they've just shifted location. You talked about 5Ks. That might be on foot. And it'll only increase, my argument is that it would only increase as we move into a higher threat environment, because LZs will become untenable more and more often. So that sort of dismounted component is going to be greater. So you talked before about flying low, right? Ideally, you want to fly low, I presume, so you can move quickly throughout the through the threats and the stuff. What stops you from, in the same way that I talked to the Super Hornet backseater about flying too low, what stops you from flying high and avoiding sort of a bubble of air defence, for example, by going higher than it?
So in Army Aviation, we're capped out at about 10,000 feet. That's a physiological altitude limit based on the body's ability to process the lack of oxygen. That sets a height which is, in the great scheme of things, very, very low. And in that wedge between 10,000 feet and 50 feet, the integrated air defence system is having a field day. The radar horizon, we need to duck below it. The further we go down, the more we have the chance of getting below that radar horizon and getting into that terrain clutter, all the trees, the buildings, allowing us to hide under the radar horizon and inside that clutter so we can move around without being detected by search radars, tracking radars, and fire control radars.
And so that's all applied to the land. Well, the altitude thing is applied to both land and sea. But if we switch tack, I just gave an example of picking troops up from one area, parade ground, and dropping them off at a field training area into the battle space. But so say let's overlay that, the same considerations, which I presume become amplified in a maritime environment. We're talking about deck landings, notoriously dangerous, again, from my arbitrary understanding looking in. What are the differences when we shift tack to maritime operations?
Maritime operations brings with it a significantly more process-driven environment. In order to get off the ship and get onto the ship, the admin burden is significantly greater, and that adds a lot of time to the process. So from the point of the gun going up and we need to move things around, the point at which we can actually decide, okay, we're going to do this, to then getting off, a lot of time there. Same thing with recovery. And there's all these complications about whether the dock's down, whether they have barges coming in. That'll affect the shoal. The shoal is an agreement between the ship's deck and the aircraft. In the maritime context, the additional burden is that administration requirement and the process nature of working on a boat, a ship. That brings with it a whole list of considerations as to whether the dock's down, which will affect the ship's rate of movement, whether the ship's inshore or in an outer transit area, and also whether the ship can manoeuvre to establish themselves in an environment which is suitable for landing and recovery. Because sometimes the ship will have its dock down, for example, I'm just talking LHDs here, and it'll be operating too slow with not enough wind over the bow for us to safely recover or launch our aircraft.
When you say recover, you mean land? Is that, yeah?
Yeah. So that is a huge consideration, and in littoral manoeuvre is negotiating all of those different assets and effects that are launching and recovering from a ship and allowing them to do simultaneously or staggered in order to achieve those massive effects on the ground. That came into full play in C Series in 2023 when we had to delay the HR because the ship could not launch its helicopters and the landing craft out of the dock at the same time due to weather effects.
So it's still restricting you even more so, I suppose, in layers in the maritime environment, I suppose. You do all this, and then let's add another layer of complexity onto it, being at night under NVG. Flying under NVG is like a unique... What sort of constraints does it apply to the pilot, I presume, rather than the aircraft itself? When you're flying on NVGs in the maritime environment, you now need to synchronise the effect on the landing helicopter dock, that being, is the dock open? What are we launching? Are we going quick enough? Is there enough wind going across the bow or coming across the bow? Like, what does MVGs add another layer of complexity or night flying?
I think the primary takeaway is that NVG is actually very, very, very good these days. We have a lot of regulations and restrictions on how many hours we can fly, and it reduces with NVG use. But the NVGs we use these days are very, very advanced and allow us to do almost the same level of competence in night flying as day flying. It's a more challenging and fatiguing flight profile, of course, but we have the benefit of very good technology in supporting that.
So we're on a ship now, you've landed and recovered, to use the technical terminology. So you've recovered and you're about to, so you talked about pushing H because you couldn't synchronise the effects or achieve two things at once on a landing helicopter dock. But say now we're starting to add in the contemporary operating environment, which is the Pacific or some jungle, high altitude sort of stuff. I imagine you guys and girls train in high altitude flying in the Pacific somewhere. Sort of how often do you do that? And how does that change the characteristics of flying or what the manoeuvre commander can expect of you?
Yeah, so the Pacific adds an additional challenge in particularly Papua New Guinea and surrounds, and it's a huge, huge expanse of very, very high altitude terrain. And when we train through that in an exercise called Helican Look, which occurs yearly, and following that is Wontok Warrior as well, we're able to support the Papua New Guinea Defence Forces. Helican Look is probably the pinnacle of defence flying, in my opinion, where you get to integrate all of your understanding of flying, of weather effects, of your aircraft's performance in a really, really challenging environment, being that the air is so thin, the rotors have less purchase, there's less Bernoullis flying over the rotors, there's less Bernoullis flying through the engine itself, providing less lift and thrust, and that itself, in yourself, you have significantly less oxygen allowed in the air that you breathe. So there's physiological effects as well. But it also it's just tied in this incredible experience of going to Papua New Guinea and training up there, which everyone will say is the highlight of defence flying.
And I suppose like the views and flying, you're trying to battle yourself plus the aircraft plus the weather and stuff, but like the views across PNG must be absolutely amazing.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I did some high density altitude training on Manam Volcano last year. There was also a flight that went out to Karkar Island, and then up in terrain, you would just never see, it doesn't exist in Australia, where you can be at 10,000 feet, which is our upper limit of what we're allowed to fly to. The aircraft can fly much higher than that.
So it's the people that limit the aircraft, is that sort of the suggestion?
Yeah, of course. It's purely a relationship of oxygen available.
Can you get oxygen provided to the crew to be able to enable you to fly higher?
Other aircraft types and other operators, the Chinook, have supplementary oxygen systems. In Australia, we just don't have those systems in use at the moment. The aircraft will fly much higher than 10,000 feet, but that's our physiological set limitation. But flying up at 10,000 feet and seeing terrain 50 foot below you is very odd when you're used to flying at sea level. At Townsville was 18 feet AMSL. Very odd.
I suppose that's when it all goes right, and my arbitrary trying to apply friction to you with night ops and you saying, well, it's actually, we're good to go. The implied task is there, plan a lot of AMO or night ops because it provides significant benefit and it doesn't restrict you in any way, shape or form. But I suppose if we launch into when it goes wrong or when things haven't gone as ideally as you thought they would, sort of, have you got any personal anecdotes about stories in which things haven't gone exactly as planned despite the lengthy mission planning and everything trying to be right, the weather working against you, altitude, buffer zones for other aircraft, UAS? When have things gone not exactly as to plan?
I think you've stitched me up here, because before we move on, I think we should just take a second to talk about where we are in this rapid state of flux in Army aviation and some of the restrictions that have been imposed upon our flying operations, just so we're pre-warning and preloading the Manoeuvre Arms Commander into the state of play and how we are limited in our flying operations at the moment. The efficacy of the restrictions aside, we are limited on flight over water and also flight at night. That places challenges on our mission planning process, but they're not unsurmountable. And we'll just work in accordance with those restrictions to achieve an outcome with the commander that we're working to.
I suppose that on the other side, the manoeuvre commander needs to give you the effect rather than the specific. If you stick drive every single component, you talked about route selection. Obviously, you'd be naive thinking you could plan the route for an aircraft. But they want to stick drive it to that and white knuckle down on the plan to that degree. They need to be willing to give you an effect that you can achieve, and then you'll work out the restrictions. Yeah,
we'll commonly sit down with an OC and they'll say, "All right, what do you want?" And they say, "I want 2 Chinooks here." I said, "Good choice, but let's talk about what we're trying to achieve holistically first."
Talking about good choice, you have always said Chinook was the answer. What was the question? You have always.
This is not true. Many a Chinook pilot's signature block have featured those lines though.
Yeah. But yeah, sorry, go back to you. So yeah, we're flexible. There's flexibility in the planning to achieve an effect, and then you combat the restrictions currently at play.
And we owe it to you to elucidate what is a current training restriction and what is more of a realistic operational outcome if we were doing this live, how we could do this with those restrictions not implied. But that's a conversation. Every role in the Army has war game and training restrictions, and that's just not unique to us. But we'll have that conversation with you about how we will play that now in this training environment, and if the flag did go up, how that would look differently.
And to flesh that out in planning rather than to I assume, yeah. So that's, I obviously took us in the wrong direction. You've corrected me by saying that, remember the safety considerations, but so more broadly, have you had anything that's gone wrong from a safety concern? Obviously maintenance test pilot, so maybe not in your test pilot stuff, but more so across your flying, what sort of things can go wrong?
Yeah, I think in the test pilot flying, you're pretty swept up in terms of what you're expecting to go wrong. So it's less of a shock. I'd certainly have had shocks before. One notably where we were transiting back from the training area at night on a very, very dark night. As we passed over Harvey Range, we're about 1,500 feet descending down towards Townsville. And I had this noise just emanating from above me where the forward transmission is. And ironically, we were doing a practice emergency for a check I was being assessed on. And, all the instructors always start off a practice emergency by saying, "Can you guys smell that? Can you guys hear that?" But this time I said, "Hang on a second, I'm just going to put the checklist away. Can you guys hear that?" And it turned out to be a hydraulic pump that was cavitating just above our head. So one of the hydraulic unions, one of the linkages between the hydraulic lines had let go, and the hydraulic oil of fluid was spilling straight down into the aircraft. We have redundant systems, so that was not so much a concern, but the pure noise and stress of the environment, I did not expect that at all. It was further complicated when our ramp aircrewman misidentified on the maintenance panel that it was 1 and 2 systems that were failing, therefore a dual hydraulic failure, which up the front we would expect that with controls that were locked and we wouldn't be able to move the controls at all, which essentially means you're in a fixed position and you're just falling in that fixed position or climbing, whatever those controls positions may be. That was very concerning. In that case, we were able to get our aircraft onto a sort of landing heading, and then with the and it's a great team environment. The right gun, the right hand side aircrewman called a landing area that he thought was suitable, and we've flown the aircraft down to the ground there. In the stress of the moment, I put the rear wheels down and just dumped the lever. And poor Jai, he was half outside the aircraft, leaning over to look at the ground surface, and I've just split him right over the right door. But he was fine. And the whole reason I've split poor Jai over the right gun window is because the elephant grass in this paddock was about 1.5 meters high. We landed in a swamp. It was the worst landing area I could have picked. And I've thought that we're almost on the ground. So I've just dumped the lever and we've just swung like a cantilever down and straight into the ground. Thankfully, old Jai was all right. I've walked out after we jumped out of the seat through this little companionway into the back of the chook, and there was hydraulic fluid everywhere. And in the chaos of being like, right, okay, let's sort out what we're going to do. We're going to have to pick at this aircraft. It's going to get fixed in the morning. One of the air crewmen have walked out, and the station owners of this paddock, which turned out to be the backyard paddock of the Harvey Range Rodeo, have driven out on ATV, and they're all pissed. There's about 6 of them. They're all pissed. And Jai's walked out. He's wearing his whole complement of cams, like the sort of body armor we wear. And then he's got a helmet with this stormtrooper maxillofacial mask. And then he's got night vision goggles. He's walked out there with no lights at all in front of a chopper. And these station owners thought it was an alien. They were scared straight out of their socks. They were unbelievable. The next day we rocked up. They gave us a Polaris and they just let us drive through the swamp. All the tradies came in. It was one of the most enjoyable working days I've had in the Army, where we had a pretty concerning maintenance issue the night before. The next day, the tradies had gone in, done a DART, or down aircraft recovery. They're starting to fix the aircraft. I rolled in with some of the aircrew. We've gone and got $120 worth of KFC, driven out to all the tradies. We're having KFC out on the top of the tunnel cover while they're fixing the aircraft. The weather's atrocious. The rain's coming in. We fixed the aircraft. It was a Friday afternoon and we flew it back to Townsville. And that 24 hours was one of the best days I've had in the Army. It was awesome. Absolutely awesome.
I love that it always happens at the end of the week as well. Like it's always on a Friday.
Every single DART happens on a Thursday night. Every time.
That's awesome.
But that aircraft is a classic example where you could be transiting fine, everything is completely normal, and you think it's all tickety-boo, and then you have some sort of maintenance challenge, and it turns very emotional very quickly. But we just talked about one vignette of things that probably didn't go very right that day. But what I want to stress here is this incredible team we have and this little tight-knit community we have. And we call it the Chinook community rather than any other moniker, because we have so many fundamental inputs, and that capability brick of 2 pilots, 3 air crewmen, and usually 1 aircraft technician, which is an incredible role we can talk about later, is supported by all of these diverse effects: our maintenance workforce, mission support, our FARPs, our refuelers. And that is all tied under this Chinook community moniker. It is awesome, absolutely awesome to be a lift pilot and work with such an incredible team, particularly our crewies and our maintenance workforce. You are living in each other's pockets, and we have quite a unique construct. Due to the safety nature of our work, we are so reliant upon each other and everyone doing their own job perfectly to ensure we can execute our role and execute it in a safe manner as well. Because we all want to come home from the flights we do. And I think that's one of the most enjoyable parts of my role, is being able to build a team, because we fly with different people every day. We get new air crewmen, new pilots in, new tradies in constantly, build a team, and then see that team continue and achieve like really, really great effects. I think that is really unique in aviation, where there's so much trust placed upon our crewmen and ATs particularly. A lot of them are retreads from different roles, and they have so much experience to give, and we are constantly asking them for advice on how we can support other people and other Army roles based on their experience. And then that relationship with maintenance as well, for everyone, not just the maintenance test pilots. there's so much trust in placed upon each other, being inputs into that high performance team. I think it's a very unique part of our role.
An awesome way to sum up the episode, because you're talking about like the team that flies the aircraft. The aircraft is just a piece of kit, right? You talked about mechanical failures and everything mechanical comes with risks and fault and stuff. But like basically that crew inside the aircraft is the ones that go to the combat team commander to do the planning, come back and briefed on about the whole plan and how it's going to work. I suppose they check the LZ before landing, as you rightly suggested that you split that air crewman over the skid on a landing. But basically, like they're doing all that work. I suppose to come back to aircraft or the rotary wing capability, what do you wish manoeuvre commanders or anyone working with helicopters to, both in exercises, obviously, but more so in current war? What do you wish the manoeuvre commanders and anyone working with aircraft knew?
I think it's important to understand that the process of mission planning is a conversation where we will try and our best to understand what you want to achieve, and we will try and convey how we can achieve it. And there's many ways we can achieve a task. And we may pull other assets or request you pull other assets in order to achieve that. But it's a huge conversation, and it's a risk-based and conversation as well. If we have this threat come up, how are we going to treat it? For you on the ground and then for us in the air, where does that line change? The coordination and command and control, it's a really, really important conversation. And the more we can sit down and really analyse the situation and the map, the better effects we can get together. What I would say in regards to modern flying and how I would sum up modern flying, which I think is changed over the last 30 years, I would sum up modern flying and modern, I guess, flying in an Army aviation context with the aircraft that we fly now. The aircraft is so complex that we are risk managers, we're system managers, and we're safety managers. Our aircraft, you could couple it up and it could fly itself. There are so many systems on that aircraft in terms of mission planning, threat analysis systems, and just flying systems, stabilization systems, that for us, our role is to understand when we have to do things manually, automate it, when we can be heads down in the computers, when we have to be eyes outside. And that ties into that risk-based conversation as well. Safety, risk, and systems is the way I would define modern flying. It's not sitting in a Spitfire where your hands and feet flying constantly anymore. We do, of course, fly, and hands and feet flying is a very important component of what we do. But in the modern mission flying context, there is so much to be learnt in that systems and risk-based context that the pilot training system really stresses on.
And like you talked about the first part, so the complexities of all the sensors and stuff that you currently maintain and all that sort of stuff in the cockpit. But the first one about the planning component, if I'm a combat team commander and I've just been allocated you as a call sign in support of the mission, basically what do you want from me, or how do you want me to approach that conversation?
We need to have that conversation of what you want to achieve, and I think focus less on. I think we need to talk about mass effects. We can get into the minutiae of how many seats we have available, but if we know we need to insert 3 platoons, does it really matter if we're talking about 18 or 19 seats? We'll just often just give you a limb fact of, say, 19 seats. There may be 2 more seats extra on the aircraft, but it becomes a lot easier to plan. And at that point, we just want to understand the intent and how we're going to achieve it. What are the additional options we can use to achieve that intent? And what are the critical timings? When do you have to have something achieved by? What is the consequence of it not being achieved by then? And what are we going to do if our communication systems break down? And that's a very significant one in this day and age. How are we going to contact you? And if we can't get in contact with you, are we going to pull you out on time?
Nice. I think that's all that we've got. We talked about crews, the state of play for Army aviation as it sits right now, constraints and limitations, but also a significant amount of opportunities the aircraft and, more importantly, the crew can achieve inside the aircraft. Leaning into planning and I suppose, no change, effects-based planning. This is the effect I want to achieve. Can you do it or can you not? And how, I suppose, you're going to do that. Thank you so much for your time, Mac. It's been absolutely awesome.
No worries at all.
Thanks for listening to the Cove Podcast. Explore our channel for more great audio PME content. Also, visit us at cove.army.gov.au for hundreds of additional resources. The Cove, the learning home of the Australian profession of arms.